Hi, folks. We're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what we can refer to, I think, quite reasonably as the parasite class. There's a massive parasite class that's been created and imported into the Western nations, primarily from third world shitholes, illiterate peasants and so on, but also a homegrown parasite class, really, the financial sector in particular. So the definition of parasite class is people who take a great deal more from the society than they contribute. Now, there are people who are handicapped. For example, the quadriplegic takes more from society than they can contribute, and that's understood. But there are not many quadriplegics, so that can be afforded in a wealthy society to a point at least. But we need to look at the multi-layer levels of parasitic behavior the West is now beset with. As I've mentioned and I'll go through them in turn, but as I've mentioned sort of many times before, I've done a lot of business traveling, and one thing that always sort of stuck out when I was going to poorer countries, there was still a lot of rich people there living in incredible mansions with lifestyles that and international real estate portfolios and so on. So it became pretty obvious that how are these people rich, so incredibly rich in such a poor country? Well, there's all sorts of things. They were effectively exempt from paying tax, while other people weren't exempt. They were given monopolies on pretty much every business. They say the president's daughter was CEO of the monopoly telecoms company in this banana republic, third world banana. It's an Islamic republic actually in this case. But and then the president's son, and he's like almost president for life, and the president's son would have monopoly on all the alcohol distribution in the country, or all the distribution of clean water, or these sorts of things, and so the intimates of the president and his entourage, family and hanger-on goons, they owned everything. They had monopolies on everything that could turn a buck, and everyone else lived in grinding. Many, or the majority, lived in grinding poverty. And once you get out of the sort of the city, or you see the shanty towns in and around the city, you see the incredible poverty that people live in. And if you get out into the the semi-rural areas, and you see people who are tilling the fields in the same way that their ancestors did 5,000 years ago, and and all this sort of stuff, technology just almost doesn't exist in these places. And so, how can they become so rich in such a poor country? And of course, there's a parasite class. Now, in this case, there aren't that many of the parasites, but they take vast amounts, and that's the proportion of wealth they take from the peasants is vast. They're definitely not sharing anything. They're taking. Now, they may, just to keep the peasants quiet, they may have a subsidized rice farming, so that because you get angry and hungry people, that's a toxic mix, and so they make sure if they're angry, they don't care. But if they're hungry, then so they do subsidies on rice and the like. But the reality is they're a parasite class taking staggering amounts of wealth from the peasants. And that struck me as being strange, because these people, again, they're inviting, as a Westerner, I was invited into their homes or meeting their offices, which were every bit as lavish as any Western office. And the peasants were staff. Then some of the fine restaurants there were, again, every bit as grand as the grandest restaurants in the West, but they're in a dirt poor country. So that's one form of parasite class. In the case of a wealthy country or wealthier country, then importing people from in large numbers from a much poorer country, and then giving them all the social welfare and benefits that had developed in the West over, or had developed organically over many hundreds of years. Giving arms, the poor laws, the all sorts of things that say developed in Britain, which had been exported actually to most of the West, in sentiment at the very least. Once you bring in a whole bunch of people who are unable to contribute, or whatever they can contribute, assuming they even want to, which many don't. And if you look at the numbers of the unemployed, the people that don't work or work, for money under the table and take jobs away from people who would otherwise work, those sorts of things. It brings in a large parasite class that are consuming and taking much more than they're giving. They have no intention of giving. They are here to take. Now, the Indian subcontinent and places like in Africa, they come from societies and with the amount of wealth that even if someone works hard for a number of 7 days a week, they wouldn't have the standard of living they can get just on welfare in the West. So for them, it's a good gig. Why should they work? They can't really work anyway. I mean, they got an IQ of 70. What the fuck are they going to do? So clean toilets or so. So there's certainly there's almost an inability to contribute to the same extent that they take. So this is a parasite class that's been imported, and not just imported in ones and twos, but in millions all across the West. And not only are they unable to contribute, assuming they want to in any meaningful sense, they're also come from societies, whether it be India or Somalia or wherever, where fraud and cheating and so on is just how things are done. They have no comprehension of a high trust society. They can't even get their head around the thought of what a high trust society is, or new wealth creation, those sorts of things. It's concepts that even Brahmin Indians, for example, the upper class caste, and even they don't get it. They just can't comprehend it. The way you get money and wealth is to steal it. That's just how you do it. And in their cognition, there's nothing wrong with that. So they have this certain. We look at, say, the behaviour of the Somalis and the fraud in Somalia and the fraud that Indians and Pakistanis perpetrate all over the West, false documents and you name it, the United States and so on, purporting to be students but really working several jobs under several assumed names illegally through sham and scam labour hire firms. To these people, they're not doing anything wrong. We don't stop them. We're the problem, as they in their twisted cognizance would see it. So there's a massive parasite class that's coming. Now, this parasite class didn't used to exist. And that was why the wealth, or the West rather, was wealthy, because there were a much smaller number of, not that they never existed, but a much smaller number of parasites and a much larger number of productive people who are producing wealth and creating wealth, and the relatively small number of parasites. The welfare state, certainly as we understand it, only began to appear during the Great Depression, and then particularly after World War II, and particularly into sort of the American Great Society in the late 1960s and so on, or mid to late 1960s. So this created the incentive to take more than you give, and created a parasite class and expanded it that didn't hitherto exist. At the same time, you've got a lot of effort being put to destroy the family unit. So if a family member fell on hard times, then they may move back in with move in with a family member and get looked after there, and maybe they would contribute in some way. They'd go out to the shop and buy the groceries, or they'd stay and look after the kids while someone else did this, or they'd mow the lawn or whatever. But they contribute in other ways, and so they were still producing something, but they weren't draining resources away from another party. Sure, they weren't producing, but then they were taking a lot less. And so, but with the destruction of the family unit, then people weren't moving in with their family or a family member. Instead, they were taking, on face value. If someone falls on stony times, I mean, why not see a problem with that? But when it becomes intergenerational and so on, and a lifestyle and a way of life, a lifestyle option, then it's clearly for its purpose, or is no longer fulfilling its purpose. But then there was yet another parasite class that the West created, supposedly on the idea that we're opening up the economy and we're going to reward people who are really building new companies and building new wealth. And I do understand that, by the way. Someone is risking everything to start up a new business that finds the cure for cancer or something. They should be richly rewarded. Nothing wrong with that. But it didn't. That isn't how it worked out. People are now being, executive positions are being very, very richly rewarded for doing nothing. They just become little socialite playthings for the rich. And I've used this example many times before, but the CEO of one of Australia's biggest grocery chains, as an example, the difference between the shop floor, like the dude cleaning the toilets or sweeping the floor, and the CEO, the difference was like 5 or 6 times in salary. So, at the time this is going back into the 60s, the floor cleaner would be paid $4,000 a year, but the CEO was only getting $20,000 a year. That was the difference. Now the CEO got plenty of other benefits packed in, like, for example, there was an executive lunchroom, executive restaurant, in effect, with an imported French chef to do the cordon bleu meals and all that sort of stuff. He had a very nice car to drive in, often a driver. This is the CEO. And there was quite a palatial house on the waterfront at a very popular beach resort area that was made available for 4 weeks or 5 weeks or something a year to the CEO for him and his family to, so there were those sorts of things that went on. They got things like overseas trips, and invariably that would involve taking in Disneyland or something like that in America. So there were additional perks, and if you sort of added those up, then it would come to much more than $20,000 a year. The value of the car and all that other stuff thrown in. But even so, the difference between pay and benefits, benefits are sort of something different. And I don't see it in exactly the same category as pay. But the decision was made to say, well, we'll reduce the tax rate, because tax on incomes above, at the time, I think incomes above $20,000, the taxes were something like 65%. So there wasn't a whole lot of incentive for people to go into the higher salary range. This is sort of 150% of the average wage would start attracting a higher tax. So there wasn't much incentive for them to do that. And so the incentives started to appear in benefits such as I mentioned a moment ago, a car or an executive lunchroom, things like that. Now the sentiment turned out, well, why don't we be entrepreneurs? Why don't we unleash the productive energies of our genius class? And if that was how it worked out, that would have been okay. I wouldn't have had a problem with it. To some extent, it did. But that productive class, the guys like Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs and other people who are inventing high tech this and so and so that was something that allowing them to keep a greater part of their income, particularly given the risks they were taking, is I think was a good move. But those people would have existed anyway. I don't think that changing a tax system brought them into existence. I think they were there anyway, and it could have been managed by giving them accelerated write-offs on expenses incurred, or double write-offs on expenses. The same outcome could have been achieved, rather than saying, well, let's just drop the tax, and then that switched the emphasis into stuffing the pockets full of money rather than producing more. And in that sense, it failed, and in that sense, it created a parasite class. So coming back now to the CEO of the grocery store chain. Back in the day, they had something like 9 competitors competing for the grocery dollar in Australia. Now, and again, only 5 times difference between the toilet cleaner and the CEO in terms of wages. Today, they have not 9 competitors, but 1 competitor. 1 competitor. So then there's no competition. The competition doesn't exist. So they have 1 competitor, or 1.5 if you want to be generous. They have 1 competitor, And yet the CEO of that company, instead of getting 5 times what the toilet cleaner is getting paid, now gets 170 times what the toilet cleaner gets paid. And for what? Are they producing more, creating more? Are they finding the cure for cancer? Are they? No, nothing like that. Nothing like that. So these people are walking away with gazillions in their pocket for producing, creating, and building nothing. It is a fucking gravy train, and these people are just pure parasites. Parasites. They're producing nothing. They don't have to compete in the marketplace for the consumer dollar. They've only got one fucking competitor, yet they're paying themselves astronomical salaries and swanning around like they're fucking gods. So this has created a parasite class of CEOs, particularly in say finance and insurance and things like that. There's a parasite class that are paying themselves gazillions of dollars for achieving and accomplishing nothing. Now, because, well, look, I'm in charge of a company, I'm CEO of a company that employs a gazillion people or something. I should be highly, but well, no, I do get that. They should be well above average salary, no question on that. But you're not competing. You're not that anyone that sits in that job will produce, give or take, the same result. You just don't have to compete. You don't have to produce anything. And in order to improve results, even though they've got like a fucking oligopoly here, they do things like they'll squeeze because it's groceries, they'll squeeze the farmer's price. So they'll squeeze the farmer down on price rather than producing any. But they're all big on saying, look how many black lesbians we employ. I mean, hey, we're good guys. Look how we fund the LGBTQ rainbows. We throw money at that. We give gazillions to those guys. Look, we're good people. We're good, So again, but this is created. They're funding yet another parasite class. The LGBTQ activism, and that is yet another, pleading for handouts and giveaways and so on. So that creates then a web of parasites. Now, if we then look at, in addition to this, we look at the expansion of the tertiary education sector. Now, the idea was when the tertiary education, and there's a lot of talk about, in America, I want to be known as the education president. I want to be known as the education prime minister. Okay, fine, nothing wrong with that. Are we going to rigorously educate more people to the highest standards of education? No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to give everybody a fucking PhD. I mean, we'll just vomit out PhDs and give them to anybody and everybody. There you go. I'm the education president. So this created an explosion in universities and teaching generally. And I've met many university academics, and seriously, I wouldn't get them to clean the toilet. They're so fucking stupid and useless. And so this has created an overall parasite class. Now the globalists have even gone one better than that, because all the big decisions and all the decisions that matter are now made by the globalist cabal. The quality of politicians and civil servants and public servants and so on has also gone into the toilet. And it's unbelievable how unimpressive. We look in the United States, the people like Jasmine Crockett and AOC and Rashida Tlaib, the list goes on, Ilhan Omar. I mean, people who are, you couldn't get people who are less impressive if you tried. And yet there they are in federal Congress. But they don't have to make decisions. It's not like it was years ago, where the people that are voted in to represent the electorate, that they are making the decisions. It's not that way anymore. The globalists are making the big decisions. The only decisions that the local legislature or parliament or Congress gets just to how many black lesbian pictures they put on the government websites. I mean, that's the only thing they're left to do. There's nothing else. They're not making any of the big decisions. And so we've created this massive parasite class. Now I could go on with things like exporting jobs overseas. The financial sector alone in Australia, just the financial sector, has exported well over 150,000 jobs into India. Now, this is an oligopoly. It's a cartel, for fuck's sake. They don't have to face any competitive pressures. What are they talking about? And they've exported all of these jobs from Australians. They've exported these jobs to low-wage India, where people are being paid, 15% of what they're being paid here in Australia. and the money that those people are paid in India, that's not taxable income that's paid in Australia. So the government has stood by and watched millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars every year just get sent off, if taxable income this is, get sent off, and tax revenue, be sent offshore. So this is creating another layer of parasite behaviour and practical reality of parasite behaviour as ordained by the globalist paradigm and the globalist model. So we live in the era of the parasite, where the number of parasites now far outnumbers the productive people. And just to add a final illustration to this, and I've mentioned this before, if I look at the best paid, most prestigious jobs in Australia as advertised on the internet job boards, for the most part, not every day, but for the most part, you will not see even a single job, not one job in the private sector. Not one, not a single wealth creating job is advertised at the best paid jobs in the country. All the government, NGOs featuring prominently, quangos, but not private sector productive jobs. And that, I think, says it all. You've been a Tassos today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.